to do that. This is the way that I think it helps students. So we're going to practice it a little bit, but ultimately, whatever way works for you when you're taking the AP exam, or say your semester exam, whatever, is what you need to do for yourself. So the 1, 2, 3 poetry analysis sounds simple, right? 1, 2, 3 sounds simple. There are 3 times that you're going to read the poem. That's why it's called 1, 2, 3 poetry analysis. The first time that we read it for the basics. We're looking at things like the title. We're kind of speculating about the title. We're going to look up vocab, maybe other allusions or references, because in a poem, every little word is significant. And if I skip over too many words, then I'm just hindering myself from understanding the poem completely, because there's always those little blackout spots that aren't clear to me. So you have to stop and look up vocab. If they reference a Greek god and there's no footnote, if they talk about some location or some war or something like that that I'm unfamiliar with, I have to go Wikipedia that real quick and just see what it is so that I can understand. I mean, if a relationship in a poem is being compared to a battle, you know, in Europe during World War I kind of have to look up that battle and just see what that's about. So I have to do that basic stuff. I also want to think about the speaker, just like you did on your assignment for this past week. Who is the speaker? Like, is it a first person speaker, third person? You know, what's going on here with the speaker? I want to think about the topics. Oh, this poem is about a porch. Oh, this poem is about love. Oh, this poem is about hatred. Like whatever the topics are of the poem, just in general. And then the last thing I'm going to look at is the basic structure of the poem. You know, how's it broken up into stanzas? How many lines? All that good stuff. All right, so that's the first reading of the poem, is I read it and then I go back and I do these sorts of things just to start getting my feet wet in the poem and start to understand the basics of it. Step 2 is where we go into the figurative parts of the poem. So when we look at poetry, there are the things that are literal, that are meant exactly as they're stated. And then there are the things that are figurative. They're not meant the way that they're stated. So when I say hit the road, I don't mean that literally. I mean, let's get in the car and go. So those are figurative type statements. These are your metaphors, right? Your personification and similes are types of metaphors. Same thing with conceit. So there are sub types of metaphors, but you know, as long as you say metaphor, you're good. Also, symbols. If I start noticing that there's a symbol, there's comparisons. I also think here about word connotation. That was in your reading on those pages 107 to 111. Word connotation are the associations that we make with a word. By that we mean kind of like, I know that if I take the word, dad, right? I know that that means a male parent. But there are connotations with the word dad. Dad makes it sort of a warm title. If I called my dad dad, it means that we probably have a warm relationship. We're probably comfortable with each other. If I called my dad father, well, that's still a male parent, but it carries a different connotation. It makes it seem like the relationship is distant or like not friendly. Or if I called my dad pops, that's sort of a, you know, down home kind of dad's my homie sort of relationship. So the connotation has to do with which word is chosen to depict that idea. And in poetry, every word is purposeful. So dad is like my example of that. If you put that there on your notes, then you'll remember that this is a male parent. That's the definition. But the word that I choose to describe male parent tells me more about the relationship. What about um, daddy? Right? Pops. What if I call my dad daddy and I'm 52 years old? Kind of juvenile. Or maybe I'm one of those, like carrying my chihuahua in my purse, fluffy people, right? Like daddy's gonna pay for everything. I don't know. So you can see how just with those different names for the same thing, I can create a connotation. All right. So in the poetry analysis, then I want to start looking, not every word has that kind of element, but I want to look at keywords that do that, connotative words. What else with figurative language? I want to look at imagery. And the main thing here is that I want to look for the effects of these things. I'm not just looking to point out, oh, here's a metaphor, oh, here's some imagery. I have to start thinking to myself, why is this metaphor here? Why are these two things being compared? Why is this relationship being compared to the tides? Or why is this moment that's being described in this poem being compared to a sunrise? So I have to think about the effects of those figurative elements. So it's not just a hunting expedition in the poem, it's a thinking expedition in the poem, if that makes sense. And so I have to do all that work in step two. Step two is probably the heavy lifting of the work that it takes to look at a poem. All right, so now I've looked at the poem twice. The third time I read it, now I need to look for meaning. If I've done enough analysis in step one and step two, now I'm looking for what does the poem mean? So what's the significance of the poem? And what is the poet trying to say to me as a reader? What am I supposed to take of this poem as a human being? So we're looking for, how does this reflect the human experience? And the way we do that in literature is to look at the theme. Right, because the theme is that statement of the life lesson. I'm going to tell you a trick, because this is the part that's most mystifying to students, I think. They can usually do all this other stuff. I can find all these things. I can label it with my scented markers and all my colors and all that stuff. But then when I say, okay, so what is the point that the poet's trying to make? So there's a big jump between level 2 and level 3 reading. And I'm going to give you the bridge that will help you get there. And it's to think about the topics of the poem. So to get to this life lesson about the human experience, this philosophical observation that's in the poem, I can think about topics. I want to list all the things that this poem is about. This poem is about hatred. This poem is about anger. This is just an example, right? This poem is about forgiveness. Any decent poem will be about a multitude of things. There's more than two. But I would not use the topic of life. People will try to do that sometimes, and I'm like, well, what poem isn't about life? You need to try to be a little specific. Try to narrow it down, right? Try to get to something, right? And then from the topics, I think to myself and I ask myself this question: what is the poet trying to tell us about the topic? Whatever topic you want. So if I felt like the poem was really heavily about forgiveness, and that's like, the other things are there, but the really most prominent topic is forgiveness, then I would ask myself, what is the poet trying to tell us or teach us about forgiveness? My answer to that question is the theme. So if you get to the point where you're trying to figure out the meaning in step 3 and it's just not coming to you, it's not coming together, you should not use a cliche. Like you shouldn't say, "Oh, an apple a day keeps the doctor away." You know, that sort of thing. You want to make sure that you're focusing on what the poem is actually saying. Then try this trick. Think like just make a little list for yourself of all the topics and then ask yourself, what is the poet trying to tell us about fill in the blank of whichever topic seems most relevant to the poem. And then when you can name what the poet's trying to teach us through that poem, then you've got the meaning of the poem. And it should reflect human experience, not just the poem itself, right? Like, don't sit on porches is not what Ode to a Texas Porch is trying to teach us. Porches can be dangerous. You know, like that's not something that we all need to learn. So this is going to be more philosophical, right? So those are the 3 steps, and you have to read the poem in between. So the first time you read it, it's just a cold reading. The second time you read it, you figured a few things out. The vocabulary will help you in the second reading because you've already looked up the words that you don't know. The next time you read it, you start looking for the deeper meaning in the elements in the poem. And if you do a good enough job with 1 and 2, then it should lead you to 3. If you get to step 3 and you can't come up with this theme or this life lesson in the poem, or you can't list any topics, then it means you have to go back and do more work with steps 1 and 2. Like you have to go back and do more analysis of those things. And then eventually you'll get this. All right, does that make sense?